A very warm welcome to tonight's lecture from our inaugural Baxandall Visiting Fellow, Professor Katie Cubitt. And before I introduce Katie, I'd like to pay tribute to Dr. Lee Baxandall, by whose visionary generosity we have had Katie with us for the last 2 terms, and fantastic it has been. Lee, who came up to Robinson in 1979 as a Natski and stayed on for a PhD and a postdoc, experienced for himself how greatly the college gains from the presence of bi-fellows and decided to make a gift that has established this new visiting fellowship. So thank you, Lee, so much. And so, on to our Baxandall Visiting Fellow. Like all the best people, Katie started out as an ASNAC before graduating in history and continuing later to a PhD here in Cambridge. She was in the Department of History at the University of York for 21 years, and then up until her retirement just recently, she took on the role of head of the School of History at the University of East Anglia. Katie's first book, Anglo-Saxon Church Councils, circa 650 to circa 850, is still the standard work on that crucial topic, and a page-turner it is too. But since then, she has published very widely countless important articles on the early history of the church in England, on England's saints, on memory, on orality, and on late Anglo-Saxon politics. Her brand new book, which will be coming out in 2025 with CUP, sounds disturbingly relevant for our own times, as it's entitled Sin and Society. Katie is an impressively productive in retirement and comes to us to give this lecture on Wulfstan, fresh from another at Norwich on Saturday about the Venerable Bede. Katie, it's been really wonderful to have you in our midst, and you've given us so much, both to the college and to the department. So we look forward now to hear you speak on an Archbishop at the end of time, politics and episcopal power, circa 1000. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Rosalind, very much for that very generous introduction. And of course, I want to start by expressing my thanks to the Warden and Fellows of Robinson for the very warm welcome which they've extended to me, and for making my fellowship at this college so enormously pleasurable and academically very, very fruitful. I must also express my deep gratitude to Dr. Lee Baxandall, through whose great generosity this fellowship has been made possible. It's been the most enormous privilege, honour, and indeed joy to be the first Baxandall Fellow. And I'm sure this fellowship will enrich the lives of future scholars and of the college in the coming years. I'd also like to extend my thanks to Rosalind as head of the Department of Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic for making me an honorary research associate. Thank you. I'm going to start with some rousing words written by Archbishop Wulfstan II of York, who's the subject of my lecture. They come from a famous sermon which he preached in Old English around the year 1000. Beloved men, realize what is true. This world is in haste and the end approaches. And therefore in the world things go from bad to worse. And so it must of necessity deteriorate greatly on account of the people's sins before the coming of Antichrist. And indeed it will be then terrible and dreadful far and wide throughout the world. This sermon is known as the Sermon of the Wolf to the English, a contemporary title probably composed by Wulfstan himself and punning on his own name. Wulfstan's eloquent and emotive sermon catalogued the sins of the English, warning them that their excessive wickedness presaged the end of the world. Wulfstan's fears concerning the imminence of the end time were prompted by his knowledge of Scripture and by his contemporary situation. St. Paul had taught that the second coming of Christ would be preceded by a time of terrible sinfulness and evil. And the book of Revelation described how Christ had imprisoned Satan in the abyss, where Satan would remain in bondage for 1,000 years. And you can see, this is 11th century manuscript, you can see him here. And of course, when the year 1000 came, people worried that Satan would be freed. So that's why the year 1000 is important in eschatology. For Wulfstan, the coming of the year 1000 coincided with a terrible breakdown in social order and in attacks on royal authority. Decades of Viking raiding had brought death, dearth, famine, and plague to the kingdom. He saw all around him lawlessness and unprecedented sin, just as St. Paul had predicted, in attacks on the church, sexual sin, theft, treachery, betrayal, and so on. The reign of Antichrist was approaching, a time of the greatest threat to the faithful, whom Antichrist would deceive and lead to their perdition. The sinfulness of the English had provoked God's anger, and their punishment was the devastation and destruction wrought by the Vikings, pagan instruments of divine anger. Wulfstan, as a spiritual leader, had to call out the sins of the English and to demand their repentance so that they could regain divine favour and fortify their faith in preparation for Antichrist's deceptions and terrors. And his response to this spiritual and political crisis was both to preach and to shame the English into penitence, and to attempt to restore them to divine favour by drafting law codes for the king, which prohibited transgression and which would enforce the Christian order essential for the temporal and heavenly welfare of the nation. So this lecture concerns Wulfstan's activities as a lawgiver, arguing that he reconceptualized the nature and function of royal law, using it as a tool for the Christian renewal of society in the form of moral legislative programs. This transformation gave the bishops a prominent role in its formulation, and this changed the relationship between the king and the bishops. To understand how and why this change came about, we need to contextualize Wulfstan both in relation to continental legislation and in relation to the contemporary English episcopate. And we need to ask where he obtained his ideas of law from and to what extent he was an exceptional figure in episcopal authority. So this lecture will do four things. I'm going to give you the historical background, then I'm going to talk about Wulfstan's legislation and its characteristics. I'm going to look at continental influence on Wulfstan's law, and finally this question of whether he was a lone innovator or a representative of an episcopal order. So Wulfstan first appears in the historical record when he was promoted to the See of London in 996. And that was one of the most important bishoprics in England. He rose rapidly, becoming Archbishop of York in 1002, a see which he held until 1016 with the bishopric of Worcester. Together with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Wulfstan was responsible for the spiritual leadership of the nation. As Archbishop of York, his role carried additional political significance as the ecclesiastical representative of the English kings, whose centre of power was situated far away in the south. This combination of religious leadership and regional authority made him a very powerful political figure. His lengthy period of episcopal office, nearly 30 years, saw the death of one king, Ethelred the Unready, and the accession of the invading king, Canute. And it's remarkable that Wulfstan remained at the centre of political life under both, and indeed he drafted law codes for both. As the subject of a scholarly biography, which is my current enterprise, Wulfstan poses some very fascinating questions because he is very, very rarely mentioned explicitly in contemporary sources. This means, for example, we don't know actually where he was educated as a churchman. We don't even know if he entered a monastery and became a monk, or whether he took the other route, which was to take clerical orders and be ordained as a priest. However, a major and meticulous scholarly industry has constructed a strong personality and identity for him by the identification of Old English and Latin works composed by him. These include the Sermon of the Wolf, which I quoted from, and some 30 to 40 other sermons, plus a tract on political thought and his legal writings. A further important contribution to our knowledge of him is provided through the study of manuscripts, largely legal and pastoral miscellanies, which can be closely linked to him. And we shall encounter some of these manuscripts later in this talk, and I've illustrated some on my PowerPoint. So this one here is it's the Sermo Lupi ad Anglo, it's the Sermon of the Wolf to English. It's a very scruffy working manuscript. If you see it in the British Library, it's actually rather small. The previous slide, this is a wonderful gospel book which actually belonged to him and was probably given to him by the Archbishop of Canterbury. This corpus of texts and manuscripts is actually a very rich resource. We can see and indeed hear him preaching at moments of national catastrophe, trace some of the intellectual influences upon his ideas, and investigate his role in contemporary politics as royal advisor. His personality is strong, exemplified by the eloquent and fiery preaching I quoted from at the beginning of the lecture. And we get a feel for a man powerfully driven by a sense of moral urgency, urging upon the king and his fellow countrymen repentance and reform. Scholars have portrayed Wulfstan as the kind of religious wing of royal government, the ecclesiastical right-hand man of Kings Ethelred and Canute. But this is, in my view, an oversimplification of Wulfstan's own understanding of his role in the kingdom. It underestimates the supreme importance to him of his responsibility as a bishop, to whom God had entrusted the welfare of the souls of the English and the protection of the church. He was more than simply a religious adjunct to a kingly government. He was a bishop with his own sense of mission. The turbulent events of Ethelred's reign unfolded against the backdrop of the peace and prosperity of the reign of his father, King Edgar. Edgar's reign was lauded after his death as a golden age, a time not only of national security, peace and prosperity, but also of the revival of the church and the restoration of monastic life. Through Edgar's support, the church was transformed. Monasteries, the powerhouses of religious life, now had to be governed in accordance with the rule of St. Benedict, the gold standard for monastic life. Many monasteries were reformed and new communities were founded. The inspiration behind these changes lay on the continent, in contemporary reforms in the 10th century church in the Frankish kingdoms, and in the earlier reformation of church and society implemented by the Frankish emperors, the Carolingians, Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, in the 8th and 9th centuries. English monks visited Frankish monasteries for training and education and brought back texts. Charlemagne had set in place a root and branch reform of the church, setting out new standards in pastoral ministry for bishops and priests and in the monastic life. And these initiatives were taken forward by his son, the Emperor Louis the Pious, in a series of councils in the first 2 decades of the 9th century, which imposed the rule of Benedict on monasteries. And Edgar undoubtedly modelled his own reforms on those of Louis the Pious. But Edgar did not act alone in church reforms, but was guided by a group of monk bishops whom he had promoted to the most important sees in the kingdom, to Canterbury, York and Winchester. And this was a very unusual step at the time, as kings preferred to appoint to bishoprics clergy from their own household, men who owed their ecclesiastical promotion through royal patronage alone, and these were not professed monks. Edgar's monastic promotions set a trend and were followed from the 970s onwards by the systematic appointment of monks, especially abbots of important monasteries, a trend which continued in the reigns of Ethelred and Canute. Now, monastic education and training were different in kind and intensity from that of the ordinary piece. Not only were these men more educated, deeply learned, but they also shared a common formation, a commitment to the ascetic life and religious purity. Moreover, as more and more bishops were drawn from the monastic order, the episcopate will have gained a sense of its own group identity and of shared values and experience. Now, the king, undoubtedly, he was the person who appointed bishops, and so the men owe their success to the king, but they shared a mutual understanding of their office and the place of the church in the world. And it's with these men that I would put Wulfstan as a monastic bishop. And it's partly, one of the reasons I think he must have been a monk is that his sees he held was so important that at that date it would be really odd not to appoint amongst them because all the others were. So I think he lies with them, and that's kind of foundational what I'm saying. Edgar's collaboration with his monk bishops established a model of Christian kingship in which kings and bishops collaborated in their joint responsibility for the temporal and heavenly well-being of the kingdom. The king was divinely appointed to govern in accordance with Christian law, to further its observance, and to protect the church. He was to provide for the secular defence of the kingdom and for its salvation. And in this latter task, he was assisted by his bishops, who also bore spiritual responsibility for the souls of his subjects and who played an important part in royal councils. The peace and prosperity of Edgar's reign was a marked contrast with the disasters which ensued in that of his son, Ethelred the Unready, which from the 980s was beset by Viking attacks of ever-increasing intensity. These culminated in 1018 with the submission of the English to the Danish king Canute and Canute's elevation to the throne. These were catastrophic events for the English. The West Saxon royal dynasty to which Ethelred belonged was the oldest line of kings in Europe, an unbroken lineage which claimed to go back to the original settlement of Britain by the English. The Viking raids had brought with them death and despoliation. Their ravaging had caused famine and dearth, and the tributes demanded to buy a respite from attack had caused a huge burden of taxation. To contemporary churchmen, such disasters could only be the result of divine anger, and Wulfstan, as we have seen, blamed the unprecedented sinfulness of the English. But some also thought that the king might be partly to blame, pointing the finger at his treatment of the church. Where Edgar had been a benefactor of the church, Ethelred had allowed his followers to take possession of church lands. The king tried to restore his kingdom to divine favour by a gesture of public penitence at a major council at 993 at Winchester. But despite the king's penitence and his new support for the church, God's wrath was not assuaged. The Viking tax resumed, placing the kingdom under such pressure that it led to a fracturing of secular authority. The king and his councillors failed to mount a successful defence against the invaders, and their leadership was seen as inadequate at best, at worse, treacherous and self-serving. A terse but telling commentary is provided by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was written shortly after Canute's succession. So this is just a kind of sample entry to give you some flavour of contemporary thought. Then a great English army was gathered from Wiltshire and from Hampshire, and they were going very resolutely towards the enemy. The alderman Alfrich was to lead the army, but he was up to his old tricks. As soon as they were so close that the army looked on the other, he feigned him sick and he began retching to vomit and said that he was taken ill and thus betrayed the people whom he should have led. As the saying goes, when the leader gives way, the whole army will be much hindered. The first 2 decades of the 11th century saw the collapse of the kingdom as the Viking armies overran it. Tensions at the top resulted in a palace coup in 1005-6, when the old guard, many prominent since the reign of Edgar, were removed, some brutally, and replaced by the promotion of others. The king seems to have been intent on a new policy. In 1007, he bought off the invading forces with tribute, and he renewed the country's defences, for example, by the construction of a new fleet. But these measures also failed abysmally. The fleet was rendered ineffective by the disloyalty of his leading men, and in 1009, an immense raiding army from Scandinavia invaded. In the winter of 1013, the king fled to Normandy, and according to Wulfstan in his Sermon of the Wolf, Wulfstan says that he was driven out, and he's berating the English for their disloyalty at this time. So the implication is that they drove him out. The invaders were led by the Danish king Svein Forkbeard, who was Canut's father, but Svein died shortly afterwards in February 1014, and at that moment Ethelred is recalled and he's restored to the throne. We'll turn to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle again for a very interesting annal, revealing profound unhappiness with his rule and indications of earlier treachery against him. Then all the councillors who were in England, ecclesiastical and lay, determined to send for King Ethelred. And they said that no lord was dearer to them than their natural lord, if he would govern them more justly than he did before. The king said that he would be a gracious lord to them, and he would and reform all the things which they all hated, and all the things which had been said and done against him should be forgiven, on condition that they all unanimously turned to him without treachery. And complete friendship was then established with oath and pledge on both sides, and they pronounced every Danish king an outlaw from England forever. So this passage reveals deep tensions between the king and his leading men. He's accused of bad conduct as a king, and they're accused of disloyalty. On Ethelred's death in 1016, his son Edmund mounted a staunch defence, but others of the English went over to Canute. Though the resistance put up to Canute was rendered ineffective by Edmund's death in 1016, and through that, Canute became the ruler of the whole kingdom. The leading men of the English met at a council at Oxford in 1018, and they made their submission to him as king. Canute, in return, imposed a fine of £72,000, which is an unbelievable amount of money on them. And this settlement paved the way for Canute to be consecrated king. So the contrast between the success of Edgar's reign and the disasters of Ethelred's could not be greater. And so after his death, his kingship was presented as the kind of apogee of Christian kingship and as a model for collaboration with the church. Ethelred's reign was distinguished by a fractious reign, by tensions between kings and magnates, when the king and the council were unable to provide secure defence. And the king was subject to challenges to his authority. So I now want to turn to Wulfstan and his characteristics of his legislation. It's in this turbulence and civic breakdown, and the civic breakdown of the early 11th century, that Wulfstan comes to the fore through his composition of law codes, reflecting his standing as a religious leader who could provide vital strategy. Wulfstan composed four law codes for Kings Ethelred and Canute. And these represent complete legislative programmes to implement Christian reform and to regain divine favour. The timing of his law codes is not haphazard. These were issued at crucial junctures in the reign. So in 1008, in the aftermath of the palace coup, when Ethelred is kind of rebuilding the kingdom and putting in place new defences. 1014, it's very obvious, the king is being restored. So the law code, in a sense, is the restoration of Christian order. And you see that again in 1018 with the submission of the English to Canute. So these are kind of statements of both order and restoring the past. And finally, the 1020 code for Winchester is a kind of great dual code, and I think that's issued after Canute is consecrated as king. So these codes aim to re-establish Christian order and to re-establish royal authority at pivotal moments for the crown. But Wulfstan's codes represent a very distinctive set of legislation and a marked shift from earlier English legal traditions. The promulgation of royal law was an ancient part of kingly power. The first code was issued in association with the conversion to Christianity by the first English Christian king, King Ethelbert of Kent. Subsequent English kings issued vernacular law codes at royal councils in consultation with their magnates, and particularly with their bishops, who very likely drafted them. These codes were all promulgated in the king's name. Alfred the Great, for example, published a great law code as a mark of English unity after the devastating Viking attacks which took place in the late 9th century. This was an ambitious piece of legislation which gathered together the older laws of the different English kingdoms and cited the precedent of Moses' 10 Commandments. Earlier English codes could therefore be ambitious and assert ideological claims to Christian kingship and also national unity. But they were predominantly tightly focused. They address key wrongs, particularly theft, and they cover legal procedure. Some have a strong ecclesiastical dimension, protecting church personnel and property, and they may also enforce certain aspects of Christian observance, such as the payment of church dues. But Wulfstan's codes are very different from these. Where earlier codes are addressed to specific issues, the archbishops are composed in an exhortatory fashion, and they systematically set out a programme of rulings for the Christian reformation of society, covering different sections of society, the religious and the laity, and enforcing adherence to the faith. So, for example, they regulate the life of monks and abbots, insisting that they live in accordance with the rule. And they impose Christian observances on the laity, such as the fasts of the church and the observance of church feast days. So their target, their aim, is to re-establish a Christian society ordered in accordance with divine law. While they do include old-style clauses aimed at particular crimes, these are incorporated within the larger purpose of the law. And they're dominated by an admonitory character. Many of their aspirations are idealizing and aspirational affirmations of principle rather than rulings aimed at a particular type of offence. So the 1008 Law Code starts with, therefore, this is foremost, that we love and praise one God, and fervently uphold one Christian faith, and entirely reject all heathen practices, and that we have all committed by both word and pledge that we will adhere to one Christian faith under one royal authority. And the concluding section includes this passage, "An injustice of every kind shall be zealously suppressed, for it is only by the suppression of injustice and the love of righteousness in matters both religious and secular that any improvement shall be obtained in the condition of our country." And they include, they say, "and every injustice shall be zealously cast out from this land as far as possible." So, this is really, in a sense, as legislation, it's kind of hopeless, isn't it? And it has got a bad press with some legal historians. And there are two further measures of Wulfstan's legislation which I want to draw attention to. And these, again, concern its form rather than its content. So his codes for Ethelred are transmitted only in manuscripts associated with him, and they reveal how he would rework an individual code in different ways, so he would produce multiple versions of the same legislation. And that's particularly striking with the 1008 code, which survives in 2 Old English and 1 Latin version. And this is unusual for English law. And while there's a debate about whether kings ever really published a sort of formal record of a law code, royal law codes are preserved outside of these, are preserved in a pretty stable form, and they're transmitted in a number of different manuscripts. And so Wulfstan's reworking of the 1008 code, and the fact that there's actually no evidence that it was diffused beyond his own circle, means it's actually also not clear what the king actually said in 1008. But that's a different problem. Furthermore, in reworking these codes, the Archbishop anonymised them, deliberately omitting Ethelred's name. So, as I said, English law codes were published in the name of the king. If you can see this, yes, good. If you look at this, it says the Engle king, the king of the English. This is Ethelred's code, and he's taken Ethelred's name out of it. And so he's anonymised them. And another one I want to show you, I'm very excited about these manuscripts. This is a manuscript in the British Library. It's got N here for the Archbishop. It's got N here for the King. This is actually, Wulfstan's hand has added Ethelred there and Wulfstan here. And we'll just read what it says because it's interesting. These legal statutes and decrees were urgently issued at our synodical council by King Ethelred, and all the magnates of the time promised that they would faithfully observe them. Therefore, I, Wulfstan, by the disposition of the grace of God, Archbishop of York, moved by the love of God and neighbour, committed the same to writing for the memory of posterity and the benefit of men, now and in the future. And I'll come back to these words. Wulfstan's freedom in reworking and revising these codes is remarkable and does not fit, as I've argued, with the usual transmission of royal law codes. Moreover, it's very striking that these three features, the variation in the text, the sole transmission in Wulfstan manuscripts, and the anonymisation of the king's name, is only found in codes for Ethelred, not for Canute. Canutes are issued in his name, and they survive in manuscripts not associated with Wulfstan. So Wulfstan's anonymisation of these codes must reflect a judgment on Ethelred's rule, a conscious decision to remove his name from the legislation and not to acknowledge his personal royal authority. And this passing over of Ethelred fits with the fact that the 1018 settlement with Canute, in the 1018 settlement with Canute, it's actually the laws of Ethelred's father, Edgar, which form the basis of the agreement. And Ethelred's just passed over. And that's actually, it's very remarkable because actually the 1018 code recycles the 1008 one. So he's using Ethelred's laws, but they're not acknowledged as such. And I think in these copies, the omission of the king's name probably means that these versions of the code must have been produced in the period between, say, 1014 and 1018, 1016, 18, when they actually weren't sure who was going to be the king. And I'm very good, I was quite worried about all this coming to right, and I'm very grateful to David Woodman, who helped me think this through. So these appear to be model legislations, templates that any king could issue. It's kind of, here's one I prepared earlier. And they represent, but they also represent a significant statement about the authority in the process of lawmaking. The law codes were to be issued by the king, but they were composed by the bishop. And as you can see in this Latin coda, it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it just says, Ethelred issued this code, but I, Wulfstan, by disposition of the grace of God, he's given a much more elevated style, a more elaborate style, and he's deliberately echoing the royal style, king by the grace of God. It's quite an extraordinary thing, I think. So, there's more, you know. Wulfstan's assertive sense of his authority in lawmaking does not stop with the drafting of model codes. He collected and copied the law codes of earlier English kings, and he drew upon these for his own codes. But not content with collecting previous royal codes, the king also adjusted them to suit the needs of the present, tampering with the text. Careful comparison of the version of the codes transmitted in non-Wulfstanian manuscripts with those transmitted in Wulfstan manuscripts reveal him inserting extra rulings in, particularly about the payment of church taxation. He adds in specific dues. Furthermore, as Ingrid Iverson has shown, and I'm very grateful to Ingrid for discussing her work on continental influence with me, he falsified a code of one early 10th century king, so where basically what it demanded was a special payment of the tithe as a kind of a religious tax, as a kind of one-off. Wulfstan converts this into the requirement that the English make a one-off payment, the English pay it on a regular basis. It's a regular annual tax, and that's quite a big change. And also, he confected laws. He attributed an entire set of legislation to earlier rulers, and he put together these laws which he ascribed to Edward the Elder and the 9th century Viking leader Guthrum. These are rather curious things to do, I think. But these interventions in producing anonymised model codes and the falsification of legislation has passed with little comment. There's a kind of acceptance amongst historians and scholars of Old English that somehow this is what Wolston did. And scholarly attention really focuses on the identification of his authorial style and this big question about whether kings produced official law codes. And while medievalists can get a bit blasé about forgery, we're used to monks forging land charters to assert property claims, and in 9th century Reims they forged a whole series of papal decretals. It's still, I think, kind of remarkable what he's doing. And what I'm interested in is this kind of his freedom and his confidence in creating these texts. And it seems to me it speaks two things. One, of this terrible crisis in England in the first half of the 11th century, and also a new conception of royal law, a new conception both of royal law and also of the role of the bishop in it. So now we get to the kind of meat, which is continental influence on Wulfstan's law. So where did Wulfstan get these ideas of programmatic exhortatory law from? And why did he consider as a bishop he had the authority to write model law codes for an as yet unknown king? The nearest parallels to Wulfstan's codes are not those of the earlier English kings. Rather, we must look to the continent and to Carolingian legislation, which provides both examples of programmatic codes and foregrounds the roles of bishops in the production of conciliar legislation. So can we trace its influence on Wulfstan? Wulfstan certainly knew one of the most important pieces of Carolingian legislation, a decree issued by Charlemagne in 789, known as the Admonitio Generalis. Now, not only does its title, the General Admonition, immediately signal its exhortatory character, but this is really the early medieval programmatic code par excellence, and it was a foundational text in the far-reaching reforms of church and society, which Charlemagne set in motion. So it starts with a series of short rulings on the institution of the life of the church, which are taken from ecclesiastical law, and that's about 60 canons. Then the second half consists of a sequence of more expansive clauses, which regulate the whole of society. And these are addressed to different groups in turn. So he says to bishops and priests, to everyone. And it sets out a far-reaching programme for the pastoral ministry in the church, and also regulates lay conduct. But you can see its exhortatory character in these extracts I'll give you. So clause 62, to all that there is to be peace and concord and harmony throughout the whole Christian people, between bishops, abbots, counts, judges, and all persons everywhere, of greater and lesser degree, for nothing is pleasing to God without peace. To bishops, to all. Further, that in accordance with the prohibition of Lord's law, there are to be no killings within the land, neither by reasons of vengeance, nor by that of avarice, nor by that of brigandage. And I think you can immediately see the similarities between what the Admonitio is doing and what Wulfstan's doing. So these regulations of the Admonitio were actually circulated very widely, but they were transmitted in a 9th century Frankish collection of Carolingian law put together by an abbot, Ansegisus. And Wulfstan had a copy of this manuscript, of this collection, in a manuscript imported into England in the 10th century. It's now in the Bodleian, it's Hatton 42. And we know that he read it well, particularly the Admonitio, because he annotated it with corrections which are taken from a second copy, which is actually independent of Ansegisus, and it's a fuller copy. And where Ansegisus abbreviated the text and admitted some rulings, Wulfstan was able to rectify it. So in this slide, we can see this is Wulfstan's hand, and he's adding, I can't read that, de mensuris et ponderibus, concerning measures and weights. And that's because his exemplar has an extra clause in it, which isn't in Ansegisus. And he annotates it, he corrects it too. And in Hatton 42, the code is also headed by a statement saying that this is canons this is legal material which Charlemagne had collected, and so it identifies it as royal law. So the Admonitio will have instructed Wulfstan in a different type of royal law from the earlier English codes, which he already knew. a type of law which is both idealizing and aspirational, admonitory in tone, and which could be used to set out a vision for the moral renewal of the Christian kingdom, regulating both the church and the lay order, and imposing divine order on each sector of society. Wulfstan not only read and annotated from the Admonitio, he also borrowed from it in his own legislation. And this is best illustrated in that Latin text of 1008, which I've mentioned, because it allows you to make verbal comparisons between the two texts. And so, I think, and forgive me for the Latin, there'll be a bit of it, only 2 slides, and then we won't have more. In 1008 and 1020, Wulfstan regulates the prohibition of false weights measures in exactly the same generalised terms that the Admonitio does. So the Admonitio says everybody should have equal and correct measures and just and equal weights. And we can see this, Wulfstan's got in his Latin statutes, he's prohibiting wrong weights and measures. And we see in the bottom of the Canute Code, and weights and measures are to be assiduously made right, and unlawful practices abolished henceforth. Now, weights and measures, that's not a common thing you find in Anglo-Saxon law. When you do find it, it's quite specific. It's what the reeve is to do, is to make sure that, you know, safeguard that. So Wulfstan's just taken this directly from the Admonitio. And we can see its imprint in another clause, where the Admonitio is condemning, you'll just take my word from this, the Admonitio is condemning pagan practice, and so is Wulfstan. And in Wulfstan's statutes, I'm very grateful for Ros, I'd ask her advice over this. In Wulfstan's statutes, you see this rare word, which actually I can't pronounce, it's tithonikos. And it means those who make divinations. And so he's condemning people who make divinations. Now, that's an unusual word. It comes from another Latin word, pythonicus. And the ultimate source is in the Vulgate Latin Bible, but not many early medieval texts have used it. But a related word is, as you can see, in the Admonitio, phytones, which is used in the condemnation of magical practices. So again, I think you can see him directly reading it and being influenced by it. So Charlemagne's programmatic ordinance, the Admonitio Generalis, gave Wulfstan a new conception of the scope of law, and integral to this, a royal office, in which kings could bring about Christian renewal and the salvation of their kingdoms through programmatic legislation. The Admonitio does not, however, explain why Wulfstan was able to give such an elevated role to the bishops rather than to the king. The degree is absolutely in Charlemagne's voice. It is Charlemagne who admonishes everyone what they have to do. But a model for legislation which does present the bishops as more leading figures in the composition of law codes can be found elsewhere in the corpus of Carolingian law, in the later 9th century reforming councils, which took place across the Frankish Empire by order of the emperor. But the evidence for this is much more tenuous and lacks the kind of clear manuscript testimony which we see for the Admonitio. There is, nevertheless, a case to be made. A key witness here is that Latin version of the 1008 Code. This is a really odd thing. Anglo-Saxon law is vernacular. And it's also a very revealing text because it tells us much more about the formalities of royal councils than the vernacular codes do, which simply describe how the code arose from the deliberations of the king and his archbishops and the rest of the council, and then you just get the clauses. But in these Latin statutes, Wulfstan describes actually what happens. It's a really interesting text. And he gives a prominent role to the 2 archbishops and the other bishops assembled in the council. It opens with religious discourses by the bishops, preaching on Christian virtue and the Trinity, and admonishing in turn each social and religious sector of the council on Christian conduct. It describes how bishops seek divine inspiration for the assembly. And while the Latin decrees state they are issued by the king, it's the bishops who come to the fore in the council's deliberations, setting the agenda by their exhortations. It gives us a glimpse, I think, of how Wulfstan thought a royal council should be conducted. And the nearest parallels I found to this are a major set of reforming councils convened in 813 by the Emperor Louis the Pious, and held at Arles, Tours, Mainz, Chalon and Reims under the presidency of the archbishops. And I'm very grateful to Martin Brett for listening to me talk about this, for discussing it. So the emperor, he mandated the convocation of the councils, but the work of the deliberation and drafting of the rulings is done by the bishops, who then reported back to him. The proceeding of these councils could have served as a model for Wulfstan in giving the bishops the leading role. They're reminiscent of his Latin statutes in various ways. At the Council of Arles, the archbishops give the opening address to the assembly on Christian responsibility, and the first ruling is a discourse on the faith, a creedal statement starting with the Trinity. The actor of the Council of Mainz likewise foregrounds the leadership of the three archbishops, describing how the assembly began with 3 days of fasting to seek divine inspiration. The council then divides into 3 groups for initial discussion: the bishops, the monks, and the lay judges. And these formalities are not exactly those as set out in the Latin statutes, but they offer similarities in the religious tenor of the meeting: the leadership by the archbishops, the part played by religious discourses in the opening stages, and this preoccupation with the different orders of society. And the parallels are very intriguing. So, for example, the opening creedal statement in the Council of Arles might have inspired the idea of preaching on the faith and the Trinity, which Wulfstan refers to in the Latin statutes. The Council of Tours, and I think this is really interesting, the first clause requires fidelity and obedience to the emperor, and that's quite reminiscent of the opening clauses of Wulfstan's 1008 codes. So I do think that the parallels between the 813 Council and Wulfstan's Latin statutes are sufficiently strong to suggest that the authoritative role that he gives to archbishops and bishops in the Latin statutes derived from them. So I think effectively what he did was reimagine an English royal assembly as a Carolingian Episcopal one, convened by royal authority, but in which the bishops take charge of the formalities and draft its conclusions. And I think this religious transformation of the Royal Assembly is also indicated by Wulfstan's reference to the divine inspiration of the proceedings. And I don't think they ever claim that for secular councils. But I could be wrong. Tom is looking at me. So Wulfstan's knowledge of the admonitio gave him an understanding of royal order as the means by which a kingdom could be restored to divine favour. But this view of law emphasised the Christian ministry of the king in his responsibility for the kingdom's Christian salvation. And in this, the king had to collaborate with his bishops, whose training and vocation equipped them to be authoritative guides. Here in the 813 councils, these revealed to Wulfstan how bishops could take the lead in councils themselves and in the drafting of royal law. And it seems to me that Wulfstan modulated this in an English setting and in the uncertainties of the 11th century when Ethelred's authority had been weakened and succession at the throne was uncertain. And it's remarkable, I think, the extent to which Wulfstan really shifts that to the bishops. So actually, even in the 813 councils, the bishops, they draft the conclusions, they send them to the king. And there's nothing like this, Wulfstan's foregrounding, I think. So what does it mean for the bishops to step in this way during crises of the kingdom? Wulfstan and his fellow bishops saw themselves as protectors of the church and as guardians of the people's spiritual welfare. It's anachronistic to see this as a benign state of affairs. Wulfstan, as we've seen, was not only zealous, but also unscrupulous in enforcing the payment of royal dues, and this is actually like to have been an onerous burden in a kingdom decimated by dearth and famine. On the other hand, the bishops were conscious of their duty to care for the vulnerable and for the poor, for orphans and for widows, and this is reflected in his legislation. Wulfstan also seems to have attempted to secure the rights of the English by his insistence on the laws of King Edgar, which resurrected the old order and also effectively set limits on royal power. There's part of Canute's second code, which includes a group of rulings which are aimed at very specific abuses of royal power. And this part of the code is thought to actually reflect the complaints that were made about Ethelred in terms of unjust behaviour and excessive demands. The codes of 1018 and 20 could therefore have acted as a safeguard to the rights of the English. This, of course, didn't stop Canute from imposing £72,000 fine, but it's not nothing. And I think there's evidence here to show that Wulfstan and the bishops were legislating not only to protect the rights of the church, but to preserve the rights and traditions of the English. Wulfstan appears to us from the sources as a solitary figure, and he was indubitably an exceptional man. But this does raise the question of how far he was a representative of the episcopate at large. How far can we generalise from him about the political role of other bishops? And this is a question worth posing because the German historian Stefan Petzold has argued in relation to continental bishops for a significant transformation in the political role of the episcopate in the Carolingian Empire, suggesting that bishops asserted the preeminent importance of their role as spiritual governors of the Christian realm. So I've wondered whether something similar happens in 10th, 11th century England. The evidence of royal councils does suggest a greater prominence on the part of bishops and the consistent promotion of monks to bishops, and the consistent promotion of monks to bishoprics from the 9th centuries must have, as I've said, fostered a strong sense of episcopal identity and shared purpose. Our problem is for English, we have so little evidence concerning the other bishops, and their careers are very difficult to reconstruct. For the archbishops of Canterbury, we mostly have very bare biographical details that tell us where they were trained as a monk, where they were abbot. And this is a huge lacuna. Wulfstan looms large, and his position as archbishop in the wild and unruly north was politically important. But he was second in prestige and in authority to the archbishops of Canterbury, about whom we know so little. We do, however, have some scraps of evidence, which I finally want to turn to, about Wulfstan's contemporary, Archbishop Ælfric. And I'm very grateful to Simon Keynes for sharing his work on Ælfric with me and for discussing him with me. It's been hugely important. And these do suggest that Wulfstan may not have been alone in his assertion of pontifical authority. So Ælfric was a monk and a former abbot. He became Archbishop of Canterbury in 995, and almost certainly that means that he must have been the man who suggested Wulfstan for promotion in 996 to the See of London. And his epitaph is preserved in a manuscript from his former monastery at Abingdon. Its celebration of his achievements is remarkable for the statements that it's made about his tenure of archiepiscopal office. And the translation you have on the screen was done for Simon by Rosalind and her husband, Nick Moyer. I'm very grateful to you. And Nick is here too, so it's very nice. So he's described as the one who stood fast as the guardian, the rector of the homeland, the defender of the kingdom, and he's also described as the well-being of the people, or I think that you could say the salvation of the people. I quite like salvation of the people, I have to say. And these claims made by his monastic brothers at Abingdon are large ones. I mean, to say that the bishop is the salvation of the people is quite something. So King Edgar described the bishops as the shepherds of the soul of the people. And Wulfstan in his Latin statutes describes how the bishops exhorted each other to be vigilant with regard to the salvation of the people entrusted to the bishops. But to say that the bishop was actually the salvation of the people is to make a greater claim. Not that he is responsible for their salvation, that he actually embodies it. It's an assertion of Ælfric's place in the spiritual economy of the kingdom, and one which was integrally linked to its temporal well-being. And it proclaims him to be its most essential element. And this glimpse of how Ælfric's pontificate was perceived does suggest that the elevated claims which Wulfstan made for his own role in the welfare of the kingdom were not purely the product of his own inflated sense of his self-worth, as we might think, but do signal a real change in the aspiration and claims of the episcopate. We should, I think, see Wulfstan both as an exceptional figure through his prominence as a teacher, preacher and a lawgiver, and as the representative of an episcopate transformed by their monastic background and through the crises of the early 11th century. So Wulfstan's promotion of episcopal authority, I think, took it to a new level, one where bishops did not simply collaborate with the king as religious advisors, but became the spiritual regents of the kingdom and a force between royal law. And this transformation was a result not only of the catastrophes of the 11th century, which royal power had been unable to support, but force of circumstances is not enough on its own to explain this step change in the role of the bishops, championed by Wulfstan. It has its roots in the changes in the episcopate in the 10th century under Edgar and was catalysed by the influence and authority of continental lawmaking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. That shows why it's good to have visiting fellows, so that they can think about all these things so deeply and so wonderfully. Katie, you are happy to answer some questions? I'm sure we've got a hungry audience and a roving mic. So, who's first? Oh yes, here we are. Ingrid.
Thank you. That was really, very interesting. My question was just about the manuscripts and Hassan 42. So do you think that Wulfstan was inspired by Charlemagne and the other Carolingian legislation because he'd happened to have a manuscript with these texts? Or did he search them out because he knew about them? And if so, where do you think that knowledge might have been preserved?
Martin asked me a very similar question. So I think I'll answer it in two ways. I think he probably gets Hatton 42 at Worcester. The 813 councils, we ought to talk about this because it's very hard to know how he has them. And I do worry because when Wulfstan has a text, he has it everywhere. And there are no direct verbal references to it. I'm inclined to think that actually he's finding stuff. And that he's finding stuff at Worcester. I think the problem is that because of the Great Fire of London, we have no archives for St Paul's, London. And that was an incredibly important house. And you do wonder what he found there. I think that he was finding stuff, partly because of what I said to you before, that if he has a text, he uses it a lot. And you get sorry about this, the Episcopal statutes. So he uses it a lot. You see it in his manuscripts. You see it in his Old English. You don't get the sense that he's got lots and lots of stuff. He minds it very intensely. Thank you.
Oh, up over there.
Thanks very much. I guess I've got a comment and a question. The comment is on this passage here, actually, the Salus Populi. And I might be mistaken, but I think this concept goes all the way back to the classical tradition. I think it's in Cicero. I was going to Google this, but I didn't want to be rude and look at my phone. I think it's also in Hobbes, Salus Populi Suprema Lex. So I wonder if this is about, I mean, there's obviously something to do with salvation of people's souls, as you're suggesting, but if there's just something about making sure the state, as it were, isn't crumbling, this is a moment when the state is under real pressure and therefore extraordinary things have to be done. And that leads into the question, which I think you said that Wulfstan has a work of political thought.
Yes, yeah.
Could you just say a bit about that, what the subject is?
Yeah, I would have liked to talk about that, but I had too much material. Salus Populi, it's also used in the liturgy, and obviously I think, but particularly on Trinity Sunday. When I've done a text search for this, which you can do on specific databases, it comes up again in Carolingian councils, and largely in terms of the bishops talk about the bishops in council talk about the Salus Populi, or Salutem Populi. But they're not identified as it. That's what I was looking for. And I need to email Stefan Patzold and ask him whether any Carolingian bishops have ever actually called the salvation or the welfare of the people themselves. So it's a common subject for deliberation in secular and religious councils, and it comes up in other contexts. As I say, what interests me is really saying bishop. So Wollstone produces a thing called the Institutes of Polity, which I think he really produces. I suspect he produces that for Canute, because it sets out the order of the kingdom, and it describes the heavenly king, the earthly king, the royal council, the duty of the layman, the bishops, and so on and so forth. And I've done a bit of work on it, but not enough. And that's a separate paper, because you can see in that what he does is make the primary task of the king the upholding of God's law. And so he puts that at the centre, and then you do see the council, in which he foregrounds the bishops, being the people who advise the king on what God's law is. So it really complements, what he's doing, what I see him doing in the councils. It's just it would have been too full of paper. So it does work with that. Thank you.
Oh. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Katie, for an amazing talk. I was going to ask about the history and the identity of his fellow bishops, but I think you've alluded to the fact that you might not be keen on a question on that, but I might try again anyway. Do we know, were his fellow bishops and were also royal advisors, other councillors of state, uniquely English? Were there continental influences crossing over the channel?
Well, they go. What we can do with monastic reform and the reforms under Edgar in the 10th century is that they go to Fleury, the big centre of monastic where St Benedict is, and they get trained there. And you can see them bring back texts. In fact, some of those texts they bring back is a council of Louis the Pious. And you can really, really see that interchange at that point in monastic reform. Nobody's actually done that for Wollstone, if you see what I mean. And Wollstone, I think Wollstone probably went to Rome to get his pallium, which is the mark of episcopal office. But there's no kind of evidence of him doing that. We don't see at the royal court, unlike actually with Alfred, there are foreigners. There's John the Old Saxon and a Frankish bishop. I mean, you don't really see that in the 10th, 11th centuries, in fact. And what I'm wrestling with, when I wrestle with the 813 reform councils, as I frequently do, as Martin knows I do, it's, is this because he's talking to people? Because, there's lots of, they're selling loads of wool. There's a lot of trade, people are going to and through. But that relates to Ingrid's question, is that Wollstone seems to have a curiously kind of circumscribed set of texts. So that's the kind of conundrum. It's a very good question, thank you.
Oh yes, I can see a couple of hands, and I didn't see which order they went up. Why don't we have Mick and then Emily? Yes. So Mick first, and then Emily. So have you got the roving mic up there? We probably need it. Oh right, I can't see because that light is so bright.
Can I ask a very humble question? When he talks about weights and measures, by what mechanism does he regulate weights and measures? Does he visualize them being regulated, and how does he know that people are cheating?
That's very interesting. I think they do know. I think the royal. Because it's absolutely. It looks an odd thing in a royal law code just to say have the correct weights and measures, but of course it is entirely fundamental to the correct ordering of the state. It's the basis of economic. It goes back, and they're getting it from Leviticus, so it comes from the Bible. But it is kind of fundamental. I think you would see. England may have collapsed in the 11th century, but it's very, very good at taxation. So it's a functioning economic community, and kings do regulate that really well. So I think they probably have reeves, and you check whether the gold is fine and so on. I have always wondered whether actually somehow the church does play a part in the regulation of that, because it comes up in the Admonitio and in an earlier English text in 786, and in the 7th century Byzantine life of a bishop, John the Faster in Cyprus. They lay out the weights and measures in front of the church. So I think there may be a religious dimension, and I've spent most of my life suspecting that there's an intense 500-page German book on this very subject, which I've been unable to find. But so on a practical level, I think the Reeves can do it, but I think there may be something else there too.
Okay,
Was it me?
yes, yes, I think I didn't spot Richard, but then, so Emily and then Richard after that. Thank you.
I'll be quick. Thanks, Katie. I'm thinking about precedent and the nature of English law.
Oh, good.
Is Wulfstan trying to pass off what are essentially reforms as sort of Edgar's laws, or is this all wholesale kind of under the mist of the past? He's not attributing it anywhere.
I think it's Edgar, because Edgar is the kind of benchmark king. He's a recent king. I do think that in 1018 and in the 2008 code, it's 1014 code, he says everything's gone downhill since Edgar. Things have been disrupted. I think absolutely in 1018 they say they will abide by the laws of Edgar. And people have thought, to pass over Ethelred as though he didn't exist is a remarkable statement. So I think that is the kind of benchmark. And I think when Wulfstan is inserting this stuff that Ingrid looked at, I think it's belt and braces in the sort of the authority of tradition. And I suspect it's also, if you could get inside his mind, it's as when monks forge title to property, it's thought that the benign view of this is that they've known they've always had it, but they can't find the charters. And so they're not really forging them, they're just sort of reconstituting them. And I think that's probably what Wulfstan thinks, that we've always done this, it just needs to be. The history of the tithe, I won't bore you with it, but actually, it's quite clear that they do impose the tithe, I think, under Edmund, but not very successfully. So I think that is why he's trying to do it.
Thank you. Now the Warden, it's your turn.
First of all, I just wanted to say, Casey, thank you. Is this on? Thank you not just for your lecture, but for everything you've contributed to the college for the last two terms. It's been fantastic having you with us, and thank you for the many, many dozens of conversations you've had over lunch dinner. It's been absolutely fantastic. Just a reflection on your Archbishop, who must have been an amazing survivor to have survived the break of kingship. But as a lawmaker, he just comes across as deeply odd and a bit tragic, because he's kind of, his legislation doesn't read as legislation, it reads as kind of poetry and preaching. Yes. It's not even clear that it was ever promulgated by any king. It kind of got the impression that they slightly humoured him. They got another bump of his kind of slightly curious, eccentric legislation. And then you said he was a loner, and I just wondered, is he a disappointment as a lawmaker, and is he maybe better as an archbishop?
Actually, the thing with people have written about how Wulfstan can't distinguish between sermons and law codes, which is probably a terrible confusion to have. Very boring in both situations, I would think. But I think, seriously, I think in some senses, what is fundamental to him is a well-established view in early medieval texts that it is the role of the bishop to tell people when they're sinning. And if you don't tell people, if you don't rebuke somebody when they're sinning because they're too rich and they're too powerful, so you're not going to tell them that they can't have 3 wives or something because you're scared of them. If you don't rebuke their sin, you could go before God on Judgment Day with those sins on you. So I think, in a way, this aspirational stuff, the pragmatic answer is he knew he could go to Judgment Day having told people off. And I do think I think they took that really seriously, if you see what I mean. And he tells other bishops to do that. So I think, in a way, he's not sad because he probably thinks, by dint of all this preaching and so on, he's assured his own salvation.
We've got one here.
Thank you. Just going back to the document you showed us, which had the letter N in place of an actual name of the King of England, and later repeated the letter N in reference to the Archbishop of York.
That's a very good point.
You referred to this as possibly a template for something which could be issued or reissued when the identity of the king was clear. But why should the Archbishop of York be named in this way? Because a future Archbishop might well not have this role of advisor to the King of England. It's not in his provincial capacity, because this is something for the whole of England and not just for the north.
That's a very good point, I think. And actually I need to think, it is important that he also anonymises himself. I think this document is at the end of what I call the Latin statutes, where he's rewritten the Old English laws as a kind of Carolingian council. And the manuscript it is in is actually his own liturgical book. It's his bishop's book of liturgy. So I think probably what he thinks is this is how you do a council, and I'll put it in my liturgical book, and then when I need to do a council. The other very interesting thing with Wulfstan is the extent to which he produces manuscript miscellanies of various texts, which might be for his own use, but might be for the use of other bishops. And so whether in this he thinks, I'll give this manuscript to another bishop, my successor or something, and then he knows how to do it. But that's very helpful, thank you. I need to think more about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think there's a question up there.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Katie. That was really very interesting. Am I? Yeah, I am broadcasting. You mentioned in the answer to a question a couple of hours ago that this is the law of God, and the weights and measures coming from Leviticus. In one of the parallel slides you showed, which had the admonitio on one side, it wasn't that one. I noticed that was I think it was on this one, where under the admonitio it refers to the law of the Lord, just as we have it commanded in the law of the Lord, and then underneath there's a quotation from Solomon, so presumably from Proverbs, about weights and measures, which aren't there in the parallel. So I was just wondering, does he use scripture as an authority at all, or where it is in some of his sources, does he drop it? What sort of role does scripture have as a source of authority explicitly as opposed to implicitly?
He uses it in his preaching. He doesn't, I think, use it in his law codes. I think when he reads the admonitio, probably one of the things he likes about it is he recognises the Bible. So I think for him reading the admonitio, that depth of biblical stuff reinforces the importance of this legislation for him. But I don't think, and I may be wrong, but I don't think he imports it in his laws. So that's the answer.
Thank you. I think there's a question up the back there. If we can get the microphone up to the back there.
Thank you, Katie. Sounds like sort of driving at something we've already been talking about here, but here's a third question on weights and measures. One of the things that struck me about this is, and I think it was the point you said about basically what weights and measures got to do with the church, as it were, is one
yes,
point
yes.
It did strike me. I mean, there's two ways of looking at weights and measures. One, this is something that really has a very direct impact on the laity, doesn't it, as opposed to the church. The other thing is the couple of places where I found weights and measures texts, they very often are tangled up with text on computers, because it's all sort of complicated maths, as it were, of proportions and things like this. So I'm wondering whether, as it were, that's part of it is just sort of the context of where, as it were, the slightly more theoretical text on weights and measures occur, have to do with things that the church is very much interested in.
Uses that in the Enchiridion as his defense.
Yeah.
So
That was
Big
one of the
Fest
ones I was thinking of.
Does Pictas use them? Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that at all. The source in the Admonitio is biblical in that way, and I'm interested in that because the Admonitio in 789 is preceded by that English piece of legislation in 786, and that I think is possibly the first mention of weights and measures, and that is Alcuin, and it's Alcuin, I think, using the Bible. So I think that's the route, but I hadn't thought about computers at all, and that would be really interesting to... Do you think, in a way, because they have that technical know-how, that they also have a responsibility for supervision?
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's really interesting.
Anybody else? We might have perhaps allow for one more question before we allow Katie to get a drink. Anybody else? Looks like you might be off the hook. Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you for being here.